Hi guys, it's Danny. Alrighty, today we're gonna discuss about when to repot orchids. As many of you know, many articles suggest that you only repot orchids in the springtime because that's the best time to repot orchids. Well, it's not really the case, but if you know me, you know that I cannot really give you a yes or no answer without actually elaborating a bit, because giving you a simple answer will only mislead you and do more harm. So I think it's better that you actually understand the logic behind everything so you can actually make the best decision with your particular orchid and in your particular case. As you might know, I personally repot whenever, but this whenever has some logic behind it. So let's dive into the subject, and I'll start by saying that everything related to repotting will only boil down to two main ideas: root health and energy usage. That's all you need to understand. Now let's explain why these two terms are so important. Well, think about it. How does an orchid know it has been repotted? It does not have eyes, it does not see that you provided a brand new pot or a brand new media. Well, the only way she kind of feels something changed around her is with her roots. Roots are the structures of the orchid that are actually in the media and in the pot. So whatever changes happen within the media, roots will be the ones that feel it. So an orchid will know that something changed within the pot, even though she doesn't know she sits in the pot, is by what the roots tell her and what the roots actually experience. Well, that was pretty intuitive, but now let's explain energy usage, the second main factor. Well, as you might know, roots are responsible for absorbing moisture and nutrients and actually feeding the plant, for the main part at least. Now, if you have a kind of big orchid which happens to have a very poor root system, it's easy to assume that that root system will not absorb as much water as a full root system. And as many of you have already discovered, if an orchid doesn't really have roots or too many good roots, it will grow slower, it will also grow smaller, everything will kind of be impaired, and the notorious phenomena called staling will actually happen to the orchid. Now, what actually happens is that the orchid will try to rationalize the usage of her energy. Because the root system will not be able to support all her structures, she'll have to decide where to spend more energy, how much energy, and so on. And this is why an orchid which is kind of suffering root-wise will usually grow smaller leaves, smaller pseudobulbs, just because she does not have enough energy to produce a fully grown pseudobulb or leaf. How do these things actually relate to repotting? Well, when you repot an orchid, there's a big chance you're gonna disturb the root system. And by this I mean the damage you'll actually provoke to the roots by just removing them or detach them from the sides of the pot or pieces of media and so on. You're gonna create tiny little bruises that might make a root stop growing or even kill it. Not to mention that some roots will be lost during the repotting process, in some cases. So what the orchid is actually feeling is a loss or impairment of the root system, and this is why the energy quantity will be lower in many cases after repotting. Now, I'm saying in many cases, but the truth is, in some cases, the orchid doesn't necessarily feel it has been repotted. If you don't massacre the root system, if you only damage 1, 2, 3 roots, but the orchid has a lot of roots, she will probably not feel all that much. So by you repotting it, she will not actually have problems with devoting energy. So theoretically, if you don't damage the root system enough to actually impair her growth, she might not actually feel she has been repotted. Or she might decide that the damage suffered by the roots is not that great, so she can actually put her energy provided by the roots into normal growth. Now, going back to the whole theory of repotting in springtime, you might notice that in articles, whenever they say best to repot in springtime when new growth starts, well, that has logic behind it. What that statement assumes is that the vast majority of orchids will start new growth in the case of sympodial orchids, or vegetative growth in the case of monopodial orchids during springtime and continuing to summertime. Thus, if you manage to destroy a lot of the old root system, the orchid will not suffer as much because she's already concentrated on producing new roots, thus being able to actually sustain herself further, so the energy loss will not be that noticeable. However, there is a big issue with this statement. I've tried really hard to find some logic with most orchids, But that's not the case in real life. So let's take a look at some of my orchids and see in what stage of growth they are in right now. So let's start from here. This is an Oncidium orchid. As you can see, it is producing a new growth. And it's kind of February, so it's still winter. So this one doesn't seem to want to start growing in springtime. Next one, this is a Brassivola. Whoopsie, this one already is maturing a growth, so in the springtime she might actually bloom. I don't think she will, but theoretically it should bloom in springtime if the growth is maturing now. But in any case, in springtime, yeah, she's not gonna start growing again. This is a Kalia orchid, and we have a sheath here, and I think the sheath has some buds. And if I know this Kalia, I know that she will finish blooming at the end of springtime. So theoretically, I should repot it at the end of springtime or beginning of summer. Next one is another Cattleya. This one doesn't seem to have any growths. This is a good candidate for spring growth, so this one might actually start to produce new pseudobulbs in the springtime. Next one, oh, we already have a new growth here, but it's kind of halfway. And if I know this orchid properly, I know she will mature this growth somewhere during summertime. Okay, and this is a Dendrobium Phalaenopsis. This doesn't have any growth, so this again might be a good candidate for spring growth. Up there we have a Phalaenopsis orchid. But behold, she has flower spikes, and if I know this Phalaenopsis, I know she's probably gonna stop blooming somewhere in the middle of summer. Anyway, during springtime, she will not start to grow anything. She will actually be in bloom. And so on and so forth. If I take a look at my orchids, I will find them in totally different stages of growth. It's not like most of my orchids will start growing in the springtime, but it's more like some of my orchids. So what determines when your orchid is actually growing vegetatively or is blooming? Well, first of all, the species of orchid that you have. We'll get to those species that actually have a very pronounced growth pattern, but most of them, as you can see, they're kind of free growing. Second of all, there's your environment and your climate. Now, this is an example. This is a Cattleya sent by Rachel, and she lives in Ireland. For Rachel, this Kalia orchid only produces one growth. For me, however, it produced 2 new growths in 1 year. And not only does climate matter, but where you actually grow your orchids. I grow them in a pretty warm balcony. They don't necessarily feel it's that winter outside. And because of the fact that my winter was pretty mild this year, they kind of grew faster for me than last year. So this is actually producing a new growth in a different month or time of the year than last year. So if we were to repot all of these orchids in the springtime, we will actually end up repotting them at totally different times, not necessarily when the rule specifies it's best to repot the orchid. So there is a high risk we're gonna get a little bit confused and actually damage more some of our orchids. Now there is a special type of orchids which actually follow this rule a little bit, and these are the orchids with a very distinct growth pattern. And I will mention here the Cata Sedum orchids. As you can see, they are both starting new growth. This is pretty normal. These orchids do go into a sort of a dormancy, and in most cases they go through their dormancy during winter time. Now if you repot these guys mid-growth, you can actually set them back quite a bit. Again, it has to do with that root disturbance and energy usage. Because if this orchid does not use its energy properly during its growth period, you might end up with a smaller pseudobulb or no blooms at all that year, and you can actually stale this orchid. But this is a particular case. The same goes for the nobly dendrobiums, which again have a very distinct growth pattern. And in all of these cases, it is indeed better to repot during springtime. In many cases, although you can find that odd nobilo orchid which will be done blooming in the middle of summer, depends if it's off season. But yeah, there are those orchids with particular growth patterns, deciduous dendrobiums as well, which will indeed do a lot better if you repot them during springtime. But certainly, they do not mean a majority. As you can see, most of our orchids are Phalaenopsis orchids, Kalia orchids, dendrobiums, oncidiums, and they can actually have free growth during the year. So for this reason, I cannot really say the majority of orchids will start to grow in springtime. However, I can say that yes, the best time to repot theoretically is whenever a new growth starts to form. This is already too far along, it's mid-growth, But in this case, yeah, it would be a good time right now to repot this orchid because the new growth has started and pretty soon it will create new roots, so the stress on this orchid with repotting will be, let's say, minimum. And as a side note, if you're wondering why my orchids are sitting in water, just ask me down below in a comment and I'll explain. This is not how I grow my orchids, this is just temporary. However, there are some instances when repotting should be done whenever is necessary. And this is when I actually like to repot. Now let's talk a little bit about when I find this necessary a necessity. First of all, new orchids. I find it really necessary to repot all of my new orchids. Now this doesn't really mean that I repot them as soon as I bring them home. I'm gonna assess the orchid a little bit. I might repot them in a few days, in a few weeks, in a month. Depends what my orchid tells me. Because they are new orchids, I don't know how the media is anymore. I don't know if I have pests. I don't know if the media is broken down, if the roots are okay, and I do like to repot them, offer fresh media, just so I know that everything is okay in this pot. So in this case, I do repot new orchids sometimes sooner rather than later, because many of the times I did discover a lot of issues in the media, with the media, and so on. So speaking about problems in the media or with the root system, this is actually where I find repotting orchids necessary no matter the stage of growth. To better explain this, let me give you a scenario that actually happened quite a lot in the past for me. So imagine an orchid that is just producing a new growth and a new root system. I didn't notice at the time, but in the pot I had a snail infestation. I didn't repot it when I purchased it. I thought it would do better if I didn't repot it actually. So when the new roots started to grow, they actually got munched off by the snails. And the situation got so bad that the orchid actually remained without roots, and one of the orchids actually died. And that was really not okay. So ever since then, I kind of decided that whatever new orchid I get, no matter the stage of development, I will repot it if I feel that there's something wrong in the media. Most of the times, I'm not able to tell, but I do repot them because I just don't want to lose any more orchids. I can cope with some staling, with some non-blooming orchids for a while, but I cannot cope with snails, pests, bad media, and so on. So if you want, you can think of it this way. If there's something wrong with the media, you're gonna lose the orchid anyway. Why not just repot it and be done with? So not only snails are the problem in a pot. As you can see here, I have an outbreak of molding because this is a pretty old media. So this is a perfect candidate for repotting actually. It doesn't really matter if this orchid does not have a new growth because the roots are already starting to look pretty bad. And this is most visible when I water the orchid. Whatever roots go down here in the moldy area, they tend to not do so great. This is the best example. You can see the root being okay, and then whoops, what's happening here? So in this case, even if the orchid does not have a new growth, even if it's not springtime, I find it necessary to repot this orchid for her development. If I keep it like this, the orchid will lose her roots anyway. I might as well repot it, even if it might stale. So this is why I kind of repot whenever. It's just whenever I feel it's necessary. So what can happen if we actually repot at the wrong time? Well, it can happen that we're gonna have a staling orchid, or nothing bad will happen at all. How do we differentiate? I'll go back to the root system issue. Now, these orchids were purchased at the same time, they were repotted at the same time, and they were repotted last autumn actually. This one, as you can see, did not fare so well, but I kind of knew this would happen. This orchid had a terrible root system. It really had nothing to do with the fact that I repotted it in autumn. It only had to do with the root system. Obviously, this orchid did not have enough energy to properly use it into some vigorous growth. However, this orchid did not have such a bad root system. So ever since last autumn, it grew this pseudobulb, which actually bloomed for me during summertime, and now it created another pseudobulb, which is actually producing a flower spike. So none the worse that I repotted it in autumn, when theoretically we should not repot orchids. It simply has to do with the amount of root damage and the energy loss. And of course, the health of the orchid and so on. If you have individuals that are already sick, no matter when you repot them, they will not do so great. And I have an example to show you as well. Now this is a Kalia orchid which was repotted in spring of last year. I did check the video and you can check it right here as well. I repotted it on the 20th of April. You cannot be any more spring than that. What happened was that this orchid created a very tiny pseudobulb, even though I respected the rules. However, this orchid had a major problem. She did not have any roots, and furthermore, the rhizome was separated from the rest of the pseudobulbs, so the energy quantity of this orchid was minimal. Thus, no matter if I repotted it in springtime, it still did not do so great. And then we have those orchids which are said to be notorious repotting dislikers, if you get what I mean. And this is an Engrecum. When I purchased and repotted this orchid, one of my viewers suggested that Engrecum growers go through great lengths not to repot this orchid and disturb it. Well, I kind of repotted it twice. What happened was this orchid did not get its root system damaged. I was lucky that the root system, even though not the greatest of the lot, it was not actually attached to all that much bark. And whenever it was attached to one or two pieces, I just let it be and I repotted it. My Engrecum is doing just fine. It did not stale at all. Now, it didn't bloom either, but that's a whole different story. It has to do more with my environment and the care that I provided, but nothing to do with repotting, staling, Engrecums doing really bad after repotting. It all has to do with the root system. If you damage the root system enough, of course the orchid will not have enough energy to properly grow fast and big. But if you manage not to massacre the root system, everything should be just fine. Same goes for my Collagenea cristata as well. When I repotted this orchid, many of my viewers told me they read that if you repot the cristata, she's not gonna bloom for 3 years and all of those nice rumors you usually find on the internet. Lo and behold. There is another issue with this cristata, but if you've watched my video on her spotlight, you know what happened. It has nothing to do with the repotting, it has to do with the care that I provided. But at least I have some flowers to show that repotting doesn't really mean anything if you don't massacre the root system. Now, as a final idea, yeah, orchids do have a better chance of developing normally if you repot them after they're done blooming when the vegetative growth starts. But if you absolutely must repot them at a different time due to pests or problems with root system or the media, do go ahead and repot them when you absolutely must, no matter the season. Because think of it, if you don't repot it and wait for spring, your orchid might already have all of her roots dead anyway by spring. So even if you repot it and you think, oh, she's gonna die because I repotted it, well, there's a chance she's gonna die anyway if you don't repot it. So if you're afraid of repotting at the wrong time, think of it this way. But of course, if you don't feel comfortable, you don't have to repot when I tell you to repot. There's nobody that can tell you when to repot, when is the best time. It's up to you to decide what you think is best for your orchid. You are the only person who can probably assess better the state of your orchid and so on. So in the end, do what feels comfortable to you. But I really hope you have a general idea of what's going on right now, what happens when you repot an orchid, what she actually feels, what are some stuff that can actually tell you if your orchid will do bad or if your orchid will do good. Of course, there are those hybrids which are more vigorous than others, and those species that, again, are more vigorous and more tolerant than others. But for the majority of orchids you can easily find in the shops and even in the nursery, things are really not that bad. So I hope I pointed you in the right direction, gave you some ideas at least to research further or to observe. And I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have further questions or I didn't explain anything or I forgot to mention something, just leave me a comment down below and we will talk more. If you want to see more orchid videos from me, simply subscribe to my channel. I post on a regular basis and you're going to be updated with everything that I do. If you have suggestions for me for videos, just leave me your ideas down below in the comment section and I might be able to make a video for you. If you click on the left side of your screen, you'll be directed to orchidnature.com where you'll find care sheets, identification sheets, and also you can talk to us in the forum section. And on the right side of your screen, you can click to watch another orchid video. Thank you for joining. I'll see you next time. Bye!